Thank you to everyone who's joined us here this morning, and I want to give a very special thanks to York College for being a gracious host for today's announcement. I'm State Senator Kristin Phillips-Hill, and I have the great honor of representing the 28th District right here in York County. And we stand in the shadows of the former York Narrow Fabrics Company. This site once manufactured the actual red tape that bound federal regulations in Washington, D.C. Today, the federal government has paved a roadmap for us in what reducing and reining in harmful regulations can do. Our national economy is booming. The unemployment rate is at an all-time low. Companies are struggling to fill jobs, and those are great problems to have. In Pennsylvania, however, we have a tremendous opportunity. But as you will hear today, our regulatory environment is holding us back from achieving our full potential. As the sponsor of several of these bills, I'm proud to have worked with employers, employees, and taxpayers to put together these common sense approaches to address our state's regulatory crisis. From implementing a one-in, two-out model for each regulation added, two must be eliminated to bring greater transparency to our permitting and regulatory process. Hardworking Pennsylvanians will be better served by breaking free of the red tape that bureaucrats have placed on employers and employees all across the Commonwealth. And think about all of the regulations that our hardworking citizens deal with. Teachers who are continually burdened by new regulation after new regulation. Manufacturers are having to jump through hoops all of the time to comply with the latest changes to state and federal regulations. And employers looking to create jobs here in Pennsylvania, they're confused by the maze put in place by many state agencies that halts our economic opportunity and progress in attracting top talent and allowing hardworking men and women to keep more money in their bank accounts. Several of these bills will help provide for more accountability and a more user-friendly state government. So we are here to say collectively that Pennsylvania needs to reform its regulatory process so we can unleash the power of its employees. As many of the representatives of various groups will tell you today that their businesses and members have really had to improve their customer service to survive in today's economy. It's time that state government do the same thing and be focused on the customer. Our customers are the taxpayers, and they are the people paying taxes out of their hard-earned paychecks. They pay taxes when they purchase a good or service. Unfortunately, state government has grown at a steady clip over decades, tacking on new regulation after new regulation without any check and balance. This package will improve our Commonwealth's customer service. Pennsylvania needs to do its own spring cleaning, and that's what we're proposing with these reform measures today. And I'm very pleased to now turn it over to my good colleague and friend from Hanover, Representative Kate Klunk, who is championing many of these issues in the House. Representative Klunk.
Thank you so much, Senator, and thank you all for joining us here today on this beautiful spring day. The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, and it's a perfect day to start some spring cleaning here in Pennsylvania. Like many of you, I have spent the last few weekends doing some spring cleaning of my own, combing through closets, going through all of the drawers. I had a pile for donating to charity, the pile for the trash, and the pile for yard sale. I went through all of those things, and the trash pile was actually rather large, and there are some things that you just hold on to, like the 1990s pair of teal blue platform sandals that I've been holding on to since high school. I was able to finally throw them away, and my husband is actually very, very happy. Our home is now much more tidy, efficient, and neat. Now, our homes, they're not the only things here in Pennsylvania that need some spring cleaning. The Commonwealth, we have thousands and thousands of regulations here on the books. And many of these acts and regulations were created several decades ago, and they have yet to be re-examined and evaluated to gauge their level of relevance, appropriateness, and cost effectiveness. Our Commonwealth here in Pennsylvania does not undertake a regular and systemic independent review of existing regulations, nor does it possess an organized system to provide recommendations and receive recommendations from the public, educators, business, government, and other entities here throughout the Commonwealth. With well over 153,000 regulations on the books, our state's regulatory system has become the equivalent of extreme hoarding. We need to call A&E and get hoarders in. Here in Pennsylvania, we don't get rid of anything. Essentially, we have a whole lot of clutter, and we need a Marie Kondo type person to come in and start cleaning things up. And that is exactly what State Senator Kristin Phillips-Hill and I are doing with the creation of the Independent Office of Repealer within the Independent Regulatory Review Commission in our two bills. I truly want to thank Senator Kristin Phillips-Hill for drafting this legislation. She introduced this last session in the House. And since being elected to the Senate, she is championing this issue over there. She has Senate Bill 251 in the Senate, and I have been entrusted, thank you, Kristin, with House Bill 1055 this session. Now, instead of using Marie Kondo's approach of determining an item's worth based on the joy it provides to you and that emotional connection that you have with the item, the Office of the Repealer would take a hard analytical look at the value of any act or regulation. And nothing in this legislation states that any specific regulation must be repealed. The Office of the Repealer would adopt a quantitative and qualitative rubric to assess whether any existing statute or regulation is reasonable, unduly burdensome, detrimental to the economic well-being of our state, duplicative, onerous, defective, or in conflict with another statute or regulation. Then the Office of the Repealer would work to provide a full systemic view of existing statutes and regulations to identify those that need modification, revision, or repeal. The people of Pennsylvania would also have input in this process. There would be an online system where individual taxpayers, business owners, nonprofit entities could go on and say, hey, Office of the Repealer, I need you to take a look at this regulation. We don't think that is working for the people of Pennsylvania. The office would provide an annual report to the General Assembly and to the Governor. Now, these reports would provide recommendations to us on the statutes and regulations that would need some special attention, some spring cleaning, if you will. And this would hope to aim to increase efficiency and eliminate wasteful practices in our government. In addition to reviewing existing regulations, a provision in the legislation that the Senator had talked about states that for every new regulation added to our government, that agency would be required to repeal 2. Now, this would greatly decrease the government interference in the lives of our citizens and businesses here in Pennsylvania. This spring cleaning approach, it's not novel, it's not new. This governmental regulations spring cleaning approach has been used by states like Kansas, Rhode Island, Tennessee, North Carolina, and our own federal government. These restrictions on the books here in Pennsylvania, they create impediments for individuals, local and county governments, school districts, businesses of all shapes and all sizes. It limits the economic development and the growth of job creation here in our local communities. These thousands upon thousands of regulations, they have been created under both Republican and Democrat governors. They've been piling up for decades and decades before many of us were even born or even thought of. They have truly left Pennsylvanians drowning in red tape, like the red tape that was manufactured in the building behind us. We truly have a responsibility to make sure that government is working for the people of Pennsylvania, not against them. The Office of the Repealer would work for the people of Pennsylvania to ensure that our rules and regulations here in this Commonwealth are not duplicative, are not inefficient, and are not unduly burdensome for the people who we represent. Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Representative Greg Rothman of Cumberland County for him to talk about his approach to fixing our regulatory structure. Representative Rothman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. And thank you all for being here, and my colleagues from the House and the Senate. I want to talk about two bills that I've introduced. One is House Bill 509. It deals with the permit paralysis that even Governor Tom Wolf recognized back in December when he said he would support a common sense permit reform process. We have literally hundreds of property owners, businesses, public entities like schools waiting for permits and licenses and other actions from state government, which they are waiting for without any idea where they are in the process. And so just like when you order a package at Christmas from Amazon and you can track where it is in the process, we believe that you ought to be able to track where you are in the permit process. So my bill creates an online repository with every department in the state where when you apply for your permit, it'll be logged in and you can see where it is in the review process. And by the way, this also allows for transparency that if you want to know what your neighbor's doing, you can check what your neighbor's doing and what permit they've applied to too. So this will allow the person who's applied for the permit to find out where the process is, and if it's been denied, the statutory rationale for denying or delaying the permit. We know, I spent my life in the private sector, my professional life in the private sector, that regulations are as bad as taxation when it comes to hindering businesses. We don't mind paying taxes if they're going for good things and we know what we're paying, but when it comes to regulations, it causes a paralysis, and it causes what I believe is not constructive time or productive time when you're trying to make sure that you're in compliance with the regulations. And as Representative Klunk said, over 150,000 regulations in Pennsylvania, many of which are outdated and most of which are burdensome to the businesses. But regulations are good, and there are plenty of good regulations, and if they are good, we should respect the equal branches of government, and those regulations should go in front of the General Assembly and the Senate to be voted into law. And so my second bill, 509, is the bill with permit transparency. There's a great senator from York County has the Senate version, which I think is Senate Bill 252. But 507 is a bill dealing with if the executive branch wants to impose new regulations and they're economically significant, and they should come to the General Assembly and have at least our committees vote on them. If it's a good regulation and if it makes sense, if it protects our citizens, then we should put it up to a vote and it would pass on its merit instead of allowing some faceless, nameless bureaucrat to institute institute regulations that hinder our businesses. So we're going to vote on the permit transparency this week in the House. It also allows for if the state cannot deliver the permits in time, that they would be able to bring a third-party inspector to do the issuance of the permits. We use third parties when we go to have our car inspected. We use third parties when we have our children get physicals for school or their vaccinations for school. We don't go to a state doctor for the physical. We don't go to a state garage to get our cars inspected. We use third parties all the time in our lives to meet these government regulations, and this would allow the state to engage third-party experts who have the same credentials, who have the same the same schooling, the same licensing, the same qualifications as the inspector at the state level, to use them as well. So I'm looking forward to that vote this week and debating and discussing that bill, which passed the House last session, and I've reintroduced it this session. So thank you for indulging me.
I'd now like to welcome to the podium Representative Dawn Kiefer from Dillsburg to share her approach to fixing Pennsylvania's regulatory structure. Representative Kiefer.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. This is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. Pennsylvania has been closed for business. We're extremely hostile to businesses and to our residents when they want to try to get anything done. And I have a bill, it's the REINS Act. It mirrors the federal bill. It's Regulations in Need of Scrutiny Act. Essentially, it requires that any regulation proposed by an agency that has an impact of $1 million or greater go through both the House and the Senate on a concurrent resolution before it can be implemented into code. This puts the power back into the hands of the legislative branch. And this is truly what the issue is. The issue is restoring a balance of power in the Commonwealth. And this isn't just an executive problem. That's not how we got here. We got here because for far too long, on both sides of the aisle, legislators have punted. We write these very broad laws with so many undefined terms, and then we give it to the executive and say, promulgate the law, make the rules up. It's very convenient for legislators because they're able to pass the responsibility to somebody else instead of finishing the job. We need to take responsibility to write very specific laws with every term defined before we send it to the executive so that they are truly just promulgating the intent of the legislative body. It goes back to Schoolhouse Rocks. The legislative branch writes the laws, the executive enforces the laws. It's that simple, it truly is. Because every time that our branch passes the buck, we strip the voters of their voice. Because the voters don't get to choose who that unelected, unaccountable bureaucrat is. They have no recourse for action. Each time that we do that, we need to restore this balance of power. This is a good first step. I think this is a great package of legislation that we have to try to rein in this gauntlet of regulation to help all of our businesses, our communities, get through this regulatory gauntlet. As we're dealing with permits, as my colleague Representative Rothman said, it is every facet of our communities, from our churches to our municipalities to our businesses. We're all impacted by this, and it shouldn't be this difficult to get through a permitting process, especially when we've already paid an engineer to draft or submit an application. Why do I have to wait for another engineer? PennDOT, if you speak to anybody there right now, our projects are taking 2 to 3 years on top of the general construction because we're waiting for permits. One agency dealing with another agency, often just to replace a pipe with the exact same pipe, but we still got to wait for a permit. There needs to be some common sense approaches taken. I think this package of legislation that we have proposed and the bicameral effort should help us get this to the finish line this year. So I thank you all for joining us today and taking the time to listen.
I'd now like to introduce Representative Mike Jones, York Township, my wonderful successor in the 93rd District, to talk about his experience in business and now in the legislature. Representative Jones.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Kristin. Obviously, I have very big shoes to fill. So I'm here, as Kristin sort of alluded to, a little less in my role as a new state representative and more to talk about my former business experience. I had the great honor of working for 23 years and at St. Onge Company, which is one of the best kept secrets here in York. I had the privilege of leading that company for 11 years. And in addition to that experience, what's quite relevant is, believe it or not, St. Onge is one of the leading firms in the world at helping many of the largest and best companies across the country and around the globe determine where they're going to locate manufacturing facilities, distribution facilities. And so I know firsthand what these companies are looking for when they pick a location. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of good news, and that is that York does a lot of things right. As you'll hear later on, our folks, Kevin Schreiber and his folks at the York County Economic Alliance are doing a lot of good work. We have a rich manufacturing tradition here. York has about 20% manufacturing jobs, which is more than twice the state average. We have a lot of great entrepreneurs, a lot of great legacy and tradition here. Unfortunately, a lot of the issues that we are struggling with are state-level issues. And as my colleagues have alluded to, while the nation has done extremely well under new leadership the past 2 years, which included a lot of regulatory reform, we rank, according to USA Today, just put out a report last month on economic quality of states, we rank 39th when it comes to business friendliness. Well, why is that? Okay, there's about 4 or 5 things that companies are really looking for. First and foremost is workforce. I'm proud to say that the Republican leadership in the House made that our top priority this session. We passed a number of good bills just a few weeks ago, and that's a good thing. But let's keep going. Corporate net income tax, 9.99%, okay, 3rd highest in the nation. We are an extremely litigious state. It is impossible to fathom the amount of damage that the Philadelphia trial lawyers have done to our Commonwealth and continue to do day in and day out. Lastly, the topic we're here to talk about today, permitting and regulatory issues. We are one of the most unfriendly, time-consuming states with whom to do business. A permit that might take 3 to 6 months in Virginia or Maryland can typically take a year to 2 years here in Pennsylvania. So as we look around and wonder why our population is aging, why our population is shrinking, because our children and grandchildren are leaving to seek employment elsewhere, maybe it's because we take the first 10% of companies' profits, maybe it's because we sue them routinely, and maybe it's because we make it as onerous and complicated as possible to permit, to get through the regulatory process and to either locate here or to stay and invest here. So I just want to say how proud I am of my colleagues. I mentioned earlier that York does a lot right. And I'm not saying this because they're my colleagues. I'm saying this as a former business person. We are blessed with a lot of great legislators here in York County, as well as our friends in Cumberland. Greg Rothman has some incredible business experience of his own. And so I just want to commend Kristin, Kate, Dawn, and Greg, and thank them for their efforts. I'm going to co-sponsor and support them any way I can and just say that I'm very proud to serve with them. Thank you.
I would like to acknowledge my good friend and colleague who has the honor of representing a good part of York County, Senator Mike Fulmer. He is a passionate advocate for common sense reform in our state government, and I'm very pleased and grateful that he was able to join us here today. Thank you, Senator Fulmer. And now I'd like to welcome my colleague from Northern York County, Senator Mike Regan.
Thank you, Kristin. I'm picturing the social media photograph of me talking to 3 empty seats right here. Look. So after listening to my colleagues speak, it just framed in my mind what we experience here in Pennsylvania. We are so primely positioned in the country, where we have a short drive to 3/4 of the country's population, yet we lag way behind other states. Our taxes are too high, our regulations are onerous beyond belief. We sit idly by and watch companies like Airbus and BMW and other huge companies settle in Kentucky and South Carolina, in our border states, but they don't come to Pennsylvania. Why is that? Our taxes are too high and our regulations are just out of control. These bills that are being introduced are going to be so helpful to many Pennsylvanians. The governor likes to talk about the minimum wage. What about a family-sustaining wage? What about a pension? What about benefits? What about health care? What about all these things are brought in when we lift this burden off of Pennsylvania and attract people, attract companies who can employ people with real jobs that make differences in people's lives? We need to make this state a business-friendly state, which it clearly is not. This very thoughtful legislation, which has been drafted by my colleagues who do such a wonderful job in the House of Representatives, will make an impact, will bring business, growth, jobs, industry into the state that lags behind in every category. This is smart, common sense legislation. The governor needs to get on board. We need to put people to work in this state. And I thank my great colleagues and great friends for the hard work they're doing, and I look very much forward to being supportive. Thank you very much.
I'd like to welcome Dr. James Brohl, who is a PhD economist from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, to the podium. Dr. Brohl.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here with you all today. As a researcher of regulation, I must say it's quite fun to be here at the birthplace where red tape first got its name. Pennsylvania actually has a fairly modern and sophisticated regulatory system in many respects, especially when it comes to review of new regulations. But Pennsylvania needs a more effective process for reviewing all the old regulations that gradually accumulate on the state's books. In 2017, I produced an analysis of the Pennsylvania Administrative Code, finding it contains about 13 million words in it, roughly 153,000 of which are restrictive terms like shall, must, or required. It would take an ordinary person about 13 weeks to read the entire Pennsylvania Administrative Code. Pennsylvania has a higher restriction count in its code than many of its neighbors, including West Virginia and even Maryland, although not quite as high as some other U.S. states like Ohio or New York. But tellingly, the average province in Canada has just 26,800 of these restrictions in its regulations. And the national government in Canada has 71,800 restrictions as of 2018. Now, there are some differences between the U.S. and Canada due to its parliamentary system. So Canada sometimes uses means other than regulation, like legislation or policy documents, to implement its requirements. But nonetheless, it's highly revealing that these numbers are so much lower than Pennsylvania's. Now, most jurisdictions struggle to implement a meaningful process for periodic review of regulations, and Pennsylvania is no exception. But the legislation that's being introduced today can help address this challenge. Pennsylvania should learn from other states that are also making look back at old regulations a top priority. So my home state of Virginia, for example, is implementing bipartisan regulatory reduction reform right now that marries occupational licensing and criminal justice reforms with broader regulatory process reforms. Agencies in Virginia are developing a catalog of all their rules and requirements that they'll have to report publicly, and several agencies are going to have to cut their requirements by 25% over the next several years. So it's not surprising that CNBC recently named Virginia one of the top states for business, citing its regulatory reduction program as a reason for Virginia's strong place in the rankings. Pennsylvania has the potential to be the next leader in the fight against red tape. So today I'm very excited to see legislators making meaningful regulatory reform a top priority. Thank you.
We're very fortunate to have two of York College's finest graduates here with us today. My good colleague and friend, Representative Seth Grove of Dover, is here. I would like to thank him for his support. He was very, very helpful. When I first arrived in the House, I showed him the legislation, the Office of Repealer, and he said to me, 6 years. 6 years, Kristin, is what it's going to take you to get this done. And I really don't like when I can't prove him wrong. We are also incredibly fortunate to have our very own Kevin Schreiber from our York County Economic Alliance, the other graduate from this fine institution, to join you today and share a few words about the great things we're doing here with York County's economy. Representative Schreiber.
Thank you very much, Senator Phillips-Hill. I would like to welcome everyone to the 28th Legislative District. At the risk of offending Senator Fulmer and Senator Regan, it is the best senatorial district in the state. Also welcome to the 95th District, and at the risk of turning my back to all of these folks right now, the best legislative district in the Commonwealth. I'd like to thank our host, the York College of Pennsylvania. Thank you for graduating Seth Grove back in 2002. Seth and I graduated the same year. If anyone would like photos of Seth from 2002, please see me after. And I'd also like to commend Senator Phillips-Hill for learning, apparently, an early lesson in the Senate to not give the microphone to Senator Fulmer. So thank you. As much of what was said, I'm not running for re-election. I can say whatever I want. As much of what was said, really, and I think the message today to take away is the private sector really is the muscle behind our economy. It's the economic engine that really fuels a lot of the growth throughout our Commonwealth and our country. And it really is incumbent on government to help set the conditions by which our private sector can thrive, our businesses, our individuals can get their business up and running, grow their business, and be successful, whether you're a large corporation or you're an independent entrepreneur. We stand in the shadow of industry here. We stand in front of an edifice of education, both of which really fueling our economy in York County and throughout Pennsylvania. And as was stated, Pennsylvania really does have a very diverse economy, a very strong economy, and York County is certainly a microcosm of just that. As Representative Jones had mentioned some of this, York County is the 8th largest county in Pennsylvania. We do have a very diverse industry makeup. Our gross domestic product just from York County alone is $16 billion. And manufacturing alone, as noted, comprises about 20% of that economic output, as well as just shy of 20% of the labor force. And right now in York County, unemployment is at a historic low of 3.4%. So really, to sustain and evolve a modern economy, we do need a modernized and streamlined and economically empowering government. And the phrase, in order to form a more perfect union, is set in the preamble of our very own Constitution, and we really should all be in the business of perpetual improvement and retooling government and looking at what works and what doesn't work and trying to address that is good continual practice. In a recent survey of York County businesses, 81% of respondents voted in favor of officials placing focus on streamlining processes and promoting efficiency in regulations and taxes and the state budgeting process. Today is an example of just that, and we really do want to commend all of the members of York County, Cumberland County delegation behind us today for this bicameral effort, and really thank you to Senator Phillips-Hill for hosting this today and bringing all of us together for this common cause. Thank you.
Next, I'm happy to welcome Mr. Carl Morera to the podium. He is the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association.
So if you go to the Pennsylvania Independent Regulatory Review Commission website and search the term water and only look for final regulations, the search will result in and generate 281 individual regulations. Gas will turn up 189 individual regulations. Land will result in 218 regulations, and manufacturer will result in 316 unique and individual regulations in Pennsylvania. Our employers are facing an onslaught of regulations from a breadth of departments at both the local, state, and federal level. This creates uncertainty in business planning and results in companies not growing, expanding, and hiring, or investing as they could. I've had the privilege of visiting many different manufacturers to see how they take raw materials and by the hands of skilled workers, craft them into final products. And I have heard each one of them say, in some different way, that making their customers happy is much easier than keeping the government happy. And what's at the root of this provocative thought? And the answer is very simple. It's excess regulations. Let's first understand that the business community recognizes that without a healthy and sustainable natural environment, it is difficult to maintain and attract high-quality employees. We are not saying that no regulations are necessary. However, it is equally important to ensure that environmental regulation is approached on sound scientific evidence and modern scientific evidence to ensure that regulations are reasonable, and within technological limits. A simple bright line ought to be that state regulations should not be more stringent than federal regulations unless there is a compelling reason that is unique to our Commonwealth. It is imperative that Pennsylvania regulators not enact regulations that place Pennsylvania at a competitive disadvantage to one of our competitor states. In the most recent Forbes Best States for Business report, Pennsylvania ranked 39th in the category of regulatory environment, significantly contributing to the overall ranking of 38th in the nation. This is not good enough. Lastly, because compliance itself is the public good that results from regulations, the Commonwealth should be a partner in compliance. We need for state government to end the gotcha mentality of dynamic fault finding and imposing punitive fines as penalties as means of fundraising, and instead make assistance with compliance the primary goal. The goal of Pennsylvania policymakers should be to make it the smart business decision to locate, expand, and hire in our Commonwealth compared to one of our competitor states. And that is why it is important that the pieces of legislation that are referenced here today are passed as quickly as possible. Thank you for allowing us to participate today.
Next up, we have native Yorktownian and Dallastown alum, Mr. Kevin Sunday, who is the Director of Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. Mr. Sunday.
Well, thank you, Senator, and I appreciate that kind introduction. And we want to applaud both members of the House and Senate for their leadership on this issue. On behalf of the members of the Pennsylvania Chamber, we're the largest bar-based business advocacy organization in the Commonwealth. And as we stand today, we're in the middle of two very important trends that this fits into. One, after 10 years of a strong economy, investors are looking to look to the next project. And as we start to turn and see a manufacturing renaissance in this state and in this country, folks are going to wonder, is Pennsylvania a place where they can do business where there's certainty and predictability? And that takes a well-functioning regulatory environment. The other trend that's going on is we're going to soon enter the next 10 years the biggest generational shift of income that this country's ever seen. And then that's not because we're going to pass the Green New Deal, but it's because the baby boomers are going to retire, and as they hand over the management and operations of businesses across the state, the next generation is going to pick it up, and they're going to walk into an environment where they're going to have to make some very tough decisions. And that is Pennsylvania a place where we keep this facility here, or do we move to greener pastures where there's a government that wants to work with them and make things a bit easier for them? And so that's why it's important that we have legislation get passed that makes sure the branch of government that speaks for people is taking a close look at the regulatory process and making sure agencies are accountable. And I'll give Governor Wolf credit. He's recognized this is something that needs to be improved upon, but certainly there's more that needs to be done. And as our members look to invest across the state, across the nation, and across the country, we want to make sure Pennsylvania succeeds. And for that, we applaud Senator Phillips-Hill and all the members of the House and Senate that are here today for taking leadership on this important issue. Thank you.
So last, but certainly not least, we have the friend of small businesses, Rebecca Euler, who is the Pennsylvania Legislative Director of the National Federation for Independent Business. Rebecca.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us here today. And I really have appreciated the conversation and the discussion and all the excellent points that everyone has made. Especially, I liked Representative Klunk's spring cleaning analogy, which I thought was great when it comes to talking about regulatory reform. I'd also like to thank her for calling attention to those of us who may have 1990s platform shoe collections in our closet and the need to maybe take a second look at those things. Anyway, my name is Rebecca Euler, and I'm Legislative Director for NFIB in Pennsylvania. NFIB is the nation's largest small business organization, representing about 300 members nationwide and over 12,000 here in Pennsylvania. I love my job because I get to work for and call attention to every day the unsung heroes of small business. You may not think about it often, but small business owners are actually heroes. They are the engine of economic growth and the lifeblood of local communities. Think of the garage down the street that squeezes your car in schedule an inspection before the end of the month. The corner grocery market, where they know the kids who stop in for a snack after school and look out for them. The farm stand down the road where you buy your fresh peaches every year. The small manufacturer where a few generations of your family may have worked. The ice cream shop that donates treats to a local school. I'm sure you can all think of many other small business stories that are woven into your daily life. Their owners are your neighbors, your friends, the sponsors of local sports teams, the first to step up when your community needs help. It's too easy to forget how critically important they are to our communities and to our economy as a whole. Pennsylvania has over 1 million of these unsung heroes. In fact, more than 99% of our businesses are small, and these businesses hire 2.5 million employees in Pennsylvania, almost half the workers in our state. And they create 2 out of every 3 new jobs, so they really are the engine of growth. Because of their size, they are super sensitive to rules that are difficult to manage and consume time and energy, 2 of the most important resources that small businesses need to be successful. Let's take a local landscaping business whose owner has a few employees. She is her business's CEO, HR manager, communications director, advertising executive, accountant, scheduler, and if there's time left in the day, she's also the regulatory compliance manager for her business. Layers and layers of regulations impact her business, and she must be an expert on all of them or face penalties. The more of her day she has to spend dealing with red tape, the less time she has to focus on her customers and to grow her business. We hear from NFIB members all the time that they could grow bigger and hire more people if government didn't get in the way. Many of the regulatory burdens they deal with are costly and time-consuming and don't seem to have much to do with safety or health. Almost half of small businesses consider regulations to be a serious problem, with cost of compliance being the single biggest regulatory burden they deal with, followed by difficulty understanding what they must do to comply and extra paperwork required. Each of the bills we've been discussing here today will help reduce this burden and jumpstart small business growth. They will ask the state to take a hard look at current regulations to decide whether they're truly necessary. They'll require state agencies to work with their customers and be more transparent about their processes. And they ask our elected representatives to vote on regulations with the biggest financial impact, adding a new level of accountability. We are happy to support this effort to stem the tide of overbearing regulations that are crushing our small businesses, our unsung heroes. And we are looking forward to working with all of you and the General Assembly to get them done. Thank you.
So here in York County, we are incredibly proud of our history of making things happen. From our first federal government and the Articles of Confederation, to the York Plan that delivered victory to the Allies in World War II, to today, when we take the essential next step in continuing to grow Pennsylvania's economy through regulatory reform. And before I open it up to any questions, I would like to ask my good colleagues, members of the local and statewide business community, to join me here to officially cut the red tape right here in York County for the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I believe that Kevin Schreiber brought us the iconic York Economic Alliance scissors to officially cut the red tape.
It's too pretty.
We have the scissors? Oh yeah, here we go. Oh my God. All right.
Seth, watch out.
Here we go. Are we ready?
Yep. 1,
3, 2, 1.
Woo! Yeah.
So we are very happy to open it up to any questions that you may have about any of the legislation or the next steps in the legislative process that we're about to embark on. Wonderful. Well, thank you all again. Thank you to my colleagues, to members of the business community, and to all of you who've been present here today. We really appreciate it.